Again, this morning to study your word. Pray that things we say and do and learn from this morning will be applied in one's life. According to your scripture. You give those that you know they're sick, you give them, please do with us. You guide our direction. Please forgive us of our sins. Christ's name we pray.
Amen. Amen. Okay. With this morning, we're going to pick up with Abraham is again going to meet with a king down, a Philistine king by the name of Abimelech. And actually, when you look at this Abimelech, as the Bible refers to it, it may not be so much a name at this time as it is a title of the Philistine kings there in Canaan. The word seems to carry with it father of a king, or my father is a king. And it seems as though it was used at this time like Pharaoh was used in the Bible. You know, it was in reference to a king or ruler of that area, and there was a whole line of pharaohs, but you know they carried different names. Now later on in the Bible, you will see the name Abimelech being used, more of a name in the time of David and such like. So we're going to be looking at that this morning. Hopefully get through with Genesis chapter 21, beginning at verse 19 through 34, and then maybe bleed on over into Genesis chapter 22, which is going to begin dealing with the sacrifice of Isaac. So we begin this morning, and I'll do like we did last Sunday we started. We'll be calling on the brethren to read a few verses, and then we'll see what we can glean out of those verses. Prior to Genesis chapter 19, we talked last week about Ishmael and Hagar being out in the desert, and God provided for them. And he said in verse 18, "For I will make him a great nation," talking about Ishmael. And it says here that Ishmael, in verse 20, was going to dwell in the wilderness and become an archer. And I couldn't remember exactly the scripture about where it talked about him being a wild man and his hand against every man. Well, that was back in Genesis chapter 16 and verse 12. Notice what God had said about Ishmael when Hagar had left on her own the first time. Verse 12. "And he will be a wild man, his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." So we find that the lineage of Ishmael was going to be one of, looks like, contention and a warlike man. And we know as we look at the Bible, as we come through it, we find that this turned out to be so. And it's still so today. And so we talked about that in great lengths. And so we're now going to take a look at Abraham traveling a little bit south down into this land where this Philistine king was at. Bobby, do you have Genesis chapter 19 and verse 22 through about verse 24, please?
Verse 22. "Haste thee, escape thither, for I cannot do anything till thou come thither." Therefore the name of the city was called Zorah.
Bob,
Yes.
actually it's Genesis chapter 21, verse 19, verse 22.
Okay.
Yeah,
I thought you said chapter 19.
I probably did.
So it's 21, beginning in verse 22?
Uh-huh.
"And it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Bethel,
Yeah, back on.
captain of his host, spake unto Abraham, saying, God is with thee in all that thou doest. Now therefore swear unto me here by God, that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son, but according to the kindness that I have done unto thee, that thou shalt do unto me, and to the land wherein thou hast sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. And Abraham reproved Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had violently taken away. And Abimelech said, I wot not who hath done this thing, neither didst thou tell me, neither yet I heard I of it, but to the day. And Abraham took sheep and oxen, gave them unto Abimelech, and both them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, What mean these 7 ewe lambs which thou hast set by?
Okay, that'll be good. You can stop right there.
Okay.
And we'll kind of back up a little bit, and then we'll pick it up from right there. Anyway, so we have here Abraham has encountered Abimelech. Abimelech encountered Abraham. But one of the things that Abimelech had noticed about Abraham is his great blessing. Abraham was a man that was greatly blessed. He had large herds, large flocks, and we also know that Abraham had servants capable of fighting, because we know that when Lot was taken, Abraham got together around 300 or so of his servants to fight. So he had some trained warriors in his camp. And, you know, being the man that he was and seeing this wealth, Abimelech could see that it would behoove him to maybe have a treaty with this man so they could conduct, and it was probably all business related, because he could see all this. It was in his best interest to be a friend to Abraham because of his wealth and his power. And one thing too, we need to remember about this, if we look back in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 12, we notice there's a statement that's made about Abraham that maybe sometimes that we overlook. And I said verse 12, verse 2, I don't think my mind is in sync this morning with my thoughts, if that makes any sense. That's what it looks like. So we'll see if we can get the motor and the transmission in sync, okay, so the gears will shift smoothly here in just a minute. And so anyway, notice what it says here, what God had said to Abraham here in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 2. I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great. And thou shalt be a blessing. And what I want to key in on that verse is, I shall make thy name great. So the name of Abraham is a well-recognized name in this region because of who he was. Not so much as the fact that he was a warring man. We're going to see how he dealt with Abimelech in a very fair, right manner. And we're going to see that the same mode of operation of Abraham, if you will, was like he dealt with Lot. He was a man of integrity. He was a man of justice. And yet we're going to find that he was a man that, stood for what his rights were when it came to this well, because he rebukes this Abimelech about this well. Well, of course, Abimelech is going to say that he had no knowledge of what had went on down there. But anyway, that's kind of the setting of this, and who these people are and what's going on here. Now, there is some thought about this Abimelech and the Abimelech prior to long about Genesis chapter 20. There's some thought that these are two different kings. Now, I don't know about that. I wasn't there, but that just seems to be the thought pattern on it, that this is a different king here. And this is where the idea about a title coming from. So, don't know that for sure, but that seems to be the thought pattern about who this man was. Whether it was or was not, the point's the same. Abraham's going to deal righteously and fairly with this Abimelech. And notice what Abimelech says here. God is with thee in all that thou doest. Even though he was a Philistine king, he could see that Abraham was different. He could see that it seemed like everything that Abraham did, he prospered. And he did prosper because of the blessings of God. And so we find that Abimelech saw that there needs to be a covenant between myself and Abraham. And so in verse 23, we find Abimelech, now therefore swear unto me, here by God, that thou wilt not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's sons, but according to the kindness that I have done unto thee. Thou shalt do unto me and to the land wherein thou sojournest. And so we find that Abimelech wanted a peaceful accord between him and Amalek, and not only between him and Amalek, but also his future generation, because he says of my sons and my sons' sons, and so on and so forth down the line. So Abimelech could see the necessity of having this done. And so we find that Abraham said, I will swear. I will swear. And so at this time, he was putting forth an oath that he would honor the request of Abimelech. And this is quite common, and we're going to see something here in just a few minutes in these verses that maybe shadows of something that we see in Genesis chapter 15 when Abraham made the covenant. When God made the covenant with Abraham, and only God was involved, and we know it involved the separation of animals and God walking through and consuming it with fire. So, which was not something unusual in that time. We find that in that culture at that time, a lot of times contracts were sealed that way. So it was a matter of a contractual agreement, and maybe the reason God used it in that manner is that was something Abraham could relate to. Now, he could relate to what was going on. He could recognize this covenant that was going on because he had seen this before in contractual agreements. And so God didn't use anything that was not foreign to Abraham to get him to comprehend. And you stop and think about that, and you fast forward to the New Testament. A lot of Jesus' teaching was done how? In parables, wasn't it? He done that so people could understand the meaning of what he was saying. He would use earthly things to bring forth spiritual meanings. And that was done so we can comprehend. And if you stop and think about it, that's not unusual with the book of Revelations, is it? The way that it's written in such a way that he's trying to use picturesque language, if you will, to describe heaven. And he's using those things that man esteems as high, the gold and the emeralds and the diamonds and all those things like that, to try to paint a picture how splendorous that is, how desirous that should be. And so a lot of that is used to depict or use language so we can kind of have some sense of understanding of it, And so we find that it's not unusual for these types of things to go on in the Bible. And so we find in verse 25 that Abraham reproved Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had, and notice the word here, violently taken, the King James Version uses. So there was some interaction of force, it seems like, between the servants of Abraham and the servants of Abimelech over this well. And a lot of times we don't realize the significance and how important these wells are in that region. One of the things about that region over there, where they're at now especially, is it's a lot of barren, desert, dry-type land. So if you've got cattle, and here we're going to find Abraham's going to also plant an orchard, the importance of water is like gold, isn't it? And we know today over there in certain parts of the world, water is equivalent to gold. So if you've got a well of water, or you've got a stream of water on your property, then you pretty much got a gold mine. That's how extremely important it was. So having a well in your possession was huge. That was huge. And so we find that this well that Abraham had dug, Abimelech's servants had violently taken it. We find that you don't see where retaliation at that point has taken place by Abraham. What you're going to see with Abraham is this. When he got a chance to talk to Abimelech about it, he reproved Abimelech about, well, your servants violently had taken this well. And notice what Abimelech's response is. Instead of getting into I guess you could say, big warfare and battle over it, notice what happens here in verse 26. And Abimelech said, I wot not who hath done this. Neither did thou tell me, neither yet I heard of it, but today. Abimelech said, hey, wait a minute, I don't know nothing about that. I hadn't heard anything about it. No one's notified me of it. Said, I didn't give that order to your servants to go down there and take that well. He said, the first I heard of it is today. Well, you know, that really shows so far some integrity too in the eyes of this Philistine king, doesn't it? Hey, wait a minute now, I didn't give that order. You know, we need to stop and take a look at this thing and see if we can work this thing out. Said that did not happen. It didn't come from me. And one of the things here too we see is that Abraham did not mind rebuking Abimelech, did he? We know prior to the Abimelech, if it's the same one or whether it's not, and Abimelech had rebuked Abraham and he got run out of that country, didn't he? On a prior occasion. And now we find that Abraham, knowing that he's justified in the right, says, hey, wait a minute. You took this well from me. What's going on here? And so we find that they're going to come into an agreement about this well of water. Neither one can see that, is it really worth going to war over? What can we do here? And that's really what you're saying here. And we can see the fairness in the eyes of Abraham. Even though he had been wrong and that well had been violently taken, you know, what would have been maybe our first reaction on that? Hey, I'm going to get my 318 servants that's trained in warfare, and we're going to go down there and take my well back. And anybody that gets in the way, if we can't go around you, we're going to go through you. That would have been the initial response, wouldn't it? But we don't see that in Abraham. You know, Abraham being the patriarch that he was, just like dealing with Lot. He could have told Lot, hey, Lot, you need to pack your junk and get all your animals together and get all your sheep together, and you need to go that way today, now. That's kind of like our human reaction is. And Abraham could have done that. He was the ruler, if you will. He was the patriarch. I'm not going to necessarily use the word king, but in a sense, he was the king of his tribe, wasn't he? He could have done that. But no, Abraham was going to let Lot decide. Hey, whatever decision that you make, I'll go in the opposite direction. That shows a different type of mentality, a different type of integrity, doesn't it? That, hey, let's come to an agreement like this. Whatever you decide, I'm good with it. And I think we've done that a lot of times in our relationships with people and things that's went on, haven't we? That a lot of times in order to make peace, we figure out that, hey, it's not worth fighting over. Let's do this. It's not worth fighting over, so we need to do this. And so we find that we sometimes will tell people, whether it's our friends or within our household or our neighbors, hey, whatever you decide, I'm fine with. Whatever makes you happy, makes me happy too, we'll go with it. So that's the type of integrity and things that we see in Abraham. And what Abraham is going to do, notice he brings forth the first foot on this thing. In verse 27, it says, and Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them unto Abimelech. You know, that says something else there. You know, sometimes somebody has got to put the first foot forward. You can get in a stalemate and lock horns like this. Well, I'm not doing this. Well, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing it. That can go on for hours and days and months. Abraham wanted to settle this thing. So he put the first foot forward, didn't he? That speaks volumes too, doesn't it? He was willing to be the one to step out. Now, he didn't have to do that. Just like he didn't have to try to make peace with Abimelech and Abimelech him. You know, they could have went to fighting each other and maybe the narrative would be different, you know. But we're going to see that he did this, and so Abraham gave of flocks. He took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and both of them made a covenant or an agreement. And also Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Now Abimelech said unto Abraham, what mean these 7 ewe lambs which thou hast set by themselves? Daniel, would you pick up and read verse 30 through the balance of the chapter, please?
And he said, you will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be my witness that I have dug this well. Therefore he called this place Beersheba, because the 2 of them swore an oath there. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Amalek rose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days.
Right, and so here again, they take these 7 ewe lambs. And I want to back up for just a second. I want you to notice the word that's used here, has they done this in verse 27, and they made them a covenant. This became an agreement between them. Now, one of the things that we notice about these covenants a lot of times in these animals, it involved a slaughter, both parties traveling between the carcasses that's divided and fire consuming them. Now, we don't know for certain that this was like in Genesis chapter 15, but it kind of takes on the atmosphere of that culture at that time. What we do know that these oxen and sheep were used to signify this covenant. Brother Con?
I thought you were going to use the word seal.
Seal. Okay.
That sealed the covenant.
Right.
That's what he had it there for.
Mm-hmm. That's right. This sealed the covenant. So it was a binding covenant, covenant that could not be broken. Now, we know ourselves a lot of times covenants can be broken, and when that happens, it brings on great turmoil, doesn't it? So the way this was set up with these 2 heads of household, if you will, these 2 kings, this was a signed, sealed, and delivered covenant among them about this well of water. And they call the name of this place Beersheba. And this name Beersheba has to do with it being a well of water, or sometimes it's referred to as a well of water from an underground spring, which naturally that's where it would come from. So that's what this covenant established, was about this well of water. In Beersheba, historically in the Bible, we're going to find that it's going to be rich in biblical history. We find that in Genesis chapter 26, Abraham's son Isaac dug this well again in Beersheba. In Genesis chapter 28, and also in Genesis chapter 46, Abraham's grandson Jacob stopped in Beersheba as he left the promised land. When Israel took possession of the promised land, Beersheba became the territory of the tribe of Simeon and Judah in Joshua chapter 15. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, we find that Samuel's sons were judges in Beersheba. In 1 Samuel chapter 14 and also 1 Samuel chapter 15, King Saul fortified Beersheba in his battle against the Amalekites. And in 1 Kings chapter 19, the prophet Elijah found refuge at Beersheba when Jezebel ordered him killed. And also we find the prophet Amos in Amos chapter 5 and Amos chapter 8. The prophet Amos mentioned Beersheba in regards to idolatry. And so we find that this Beersheba is going to become a very important part of Israelite history and culture. Any of you brethren have any comments you want to make? Brother Con, Reed, Daniel?
I have a kind of a quick question.
Okay.
For verse 30, it says, "Take these 7 lambs from my hand, that they may be my witness that I have dug this well." Is he kind of like buying the land? So it kind of sounds
He's binding a covenant. It's a part of sealing that covenant. In other words, what they're doing here, they used, instead of doing like written agreements, of course, like we do today, and you know, like when you go buy something like a house or a car or some important business, you got volumes of paperwork, right, to sign. And this is what they're doing. And the number 7 in the Bible, I don't want to get caught up into numerology because there's some discussion on that, but numerology is kind of it's kind of interesting. The number 7 seems to denote completeness. Okay, so that completes this contract. And like I say, these lambs here, from what we can see, now it doesn't say this, I'll refer back to Genesis chapter 15, because a lot of times in serious covenants, instead of them signing the contracts, they would set up and do those sacrifices and walk between those carcasses, and they would be burned. So, did that happen here? Doesn't really say. Seems to take on that aura or atmosphere because of the sheep and the oxen and the lambs, which were designated to be used in sacrifice. But really, you can just say that made it concrete from what we can understand. Okay. Brother Con, you got anything you want to add to that?
Sir?
You got anything you want to add to that?
More than saying it, you know, when you make something verbal by the word of mouth, that's easy broken. And sometimes a contract, if you put it in writing, it can be broken with the proper person that is objecting to what you have made agreement on. If they get a objector to it, and get somebody smart behind it, they can break it. But when you put up all this stuff as a witness, that's like collateral. In other words, that's just like property.
Yeah.
And so I'm just gonna say that seals it. And it also, I'm glad you used that figure of 7, because you wonder why 7 instead of 8 or 10 or maybe
Right.
3 or 4.
Right.
7 completed it. In other words, that's keeping. They were smart enough to keep in what would be a godly manner. They were following after things of God. Had it in mind. Both of them had it in mind. So that is real mutual when you get two people thinking just alike.
Right. Yeah.
Now that is really what you call mutual.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can see really in this Philistine king, and a lot of times we don't think about those people. This Philistine king here had some sense of integrity about it, didn't he? Now, whether or not he believed in the true and living God is another question. We know he recognized that the God that Abraham believed in had prospered him.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
But I'm gonna also say, whether he believed it or not, he was a king. He'd been put in power by God, because Daniel plainly describes that thought to us, that it is God who sets them up and brings them down.
Yeah.
And that's true till this very day.
Right. Right.
You can count that off on these forthcoming elections.
Yeah.
Whatever God decides in the matter, that's going to be it.
What's going to be, yeah. And something else to think about this number 7. What about the root and origin of that? We go back to the very beginning. What was involved totally in the creation? How many days? Including the day God rested.
Yeah, 7.
Complete and full, that's right. So you have to wonder if that's not the root origin of it, because you see it used more often in the Bible than what you think, okay, to be complete and full. And so that is probably the link of where this comes from, just like what you said about the principles of God, believing and knowing about God, whether he really believed it, being aware of it. One thing, too, you got to remember about this, when these heathen kings are saying, well, I know the God of heaven is with you. You got to remember, we're only about 450 years past the flood. And you still got Shem and some of those guys walking around. So how much of an influence is that still having on the culture at that time? In other words, you still got things you've got the ark still in the background, visibly seen, if you wanted to walk up there and take a look at it, okay? So you still got that going on. So when man came out of the ark and began to repopulate the earth, we know within 100 years man began to depart, but how deep was that departure? Did it take place overnight, or was it gradual over a period of time, you see? So how much of an influence the flood and those things are still having on these cultures, I don't know that we have a real clear picture of it. I don't think the Bible gives us a real clear picture of it. Reed, you look like you want to comment on that? Okay. All right, you had that? Okay. All right, so we have to remember that a lot of times these heathen kings are not that so far removed in the book of Genesis from the flood, from the influence of some of their ancestors. So that's something else to stop and think about. And so we find that they made this covenant in Beersheba. Also, Beersheba, we're going to find is very often used to denote the entire land of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba. And you find that phrase being used like in Judges chapter 20, 1 Samuel chapter 3, 2 Samuel chapter 3, and 1 Kings chapter 4, and many others. So you see that phrase from Dan to Beersheba denoting that stretch of land in there called the Promised Land. So it's a very significant place in Israelite history. And so we find that Abraham then, he plants this grove in Beersheba, and he called the name of the Lord, he called on the name of the everlasting Lord. That's one of the things that we see about Abraham as he's doing this. We've seen him before call on the name of the Lord. We've seen him sacrificed and call on the name of the Lord. So what we're finding here is what we're going to see in Genesis chapter 22, and I think we brought this out more than once. Abraham's faith took years to develop, didn't it? I think that's very important for us to learn from it. And all these thoughts are important, but just remember that Abraham didn't get it overnight. From the time he started to the events in Genesis chapter 22 is about 50 years. It took a while, didn't it, Brother Conner?
Yeah.
And you know, and that's, you know, that's the way we have to think about it. And in his walk toward Genesis chapter 22, this is where this is headed. In his walk toward it, did he stumble and fall along the way? Remember, these things are written as an example that we might learn. Yeah, he made some mistakes, didn't he? He sure did. He stumbled, didn't he? Matter of fact, he hit some pretty deep potholes, you know, to be run out of the Southland and told not to be come back by Abimelech, didn't he? But you know what he did? He would always do what? Go back to God, wouldn't he? He would always repent. He would always make those sacrifices. He would always call on the name of the Lord, wouldn't he? Does that mean that we do that and get forgiveness and keep doing the same things? Well, no. No. That would be Catholic teaching. Sin on Friday and repent on Saturday, okay? It doesn't work that way. But it was a growing process with him is the whole point. And that's what we can learn from. You have to stay the course. Brother Conn, you can probably tell us something about staying the course, can't you?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
You have to stay the course. And in the end, if you stay the course, you'll make it to Genesis chapter 22, won't you? Yep. You'll make it. So that's the whole learning process here that I believe so far that we're learning about Abraham. We see a man leaving, we see a man that had faults, we see a man making a mistake, but we see a man repenting, and we see a man staying the course with his heart and mind toward God. And when we get into Genesis chapter 22, we're going to see not so much a faith that Abraham had, so much to produce faith, but what we're going to see is a test put to him to really reveal his faith. You see, the revealing is not coming. Not the test to produce faith. Now, he's been tested with a lot of these events happening. Now let's see if you can put your testing to work. Two different things. Yeah, two different things. But anyway, So Abraham sojourned in the Philistine land many years, and we know he planted that tree there, that tamarind tree there. And my understanding about those trees is that it takes years and years and years and years for them to develop and grow. And so what that was, as this was handed down to Abraham's descendants, and Abimelech handed it down, remember, from his sons to their sons to their sons. What does that tree signify? Where I'm from, up the country, a lot of times Daddy would show us the property lines and the property boundaries and things like that. And back in the days when all that was done, a lot of times they'd just use a pine stump and drive it in the ground or something like that. But more significantly was, I can take you right now and show you some big prosperous oak trees that's significant to property boundaries to this day. And some of these property boundaries were set in the mid to late 1800s. Now, I know today's technology and GPS and all, how much weight does that carry? Well, for generations, that was the property boundary agreed by the two landowners. This huge oak tree right here, or this stream right here on the back side of that 40 that divides the property. Guess what that was? And it was accepted, you know? And so we find that within, even within our culture, up until about post-World War II, that's kind of the way business was done, you know? Over there where that Chinaberry tree is at. We're going to let that Chinaberry tree be this, and we're going to let this oak tree be this. That was your boundary, you know? And you took great lengths not to disturb that boundary, you know. But we're not going to cut that tree because that tree is a boundary agreement. And so this is what we see going on with these things. It's something that they can physically see and hand down from generation to generation. Those trees there that Abraham planted is a part of this. It's a part of this. So it's a very interesting way of conducting business that we've kind of lost, you know, within our culture today, and we lost that in post-World War II world, really. But it's very interesting the way these things were done and how binding they were when they were done. So, any comments from any of your brethren about chapter 21 before we move into 22? Very briefly, we only got about 3 minutes, so we'll just kind of. Okay. All right, here we're going to get into the Abraham offering Isaac in chapter 22. And you know, there's a lot can be said about this here. And one of the things that we think about in this is what would we have done? Now, this is the promised son, and he's going to be told to take the promised son out and sacrifice him. You know, when you propose with something like that and you bring it down to a personal level, you have to ask yourself that question: what would I have done? You know, what would my faith be? Well, this is going to be a test, as we said, not to produce faith, but to reveal faith. And when Abraham went to slay Isaac, and one of the things when you look at that real close is, I do believe that when he went to slay Isaac, that knife was coming down when his hand was stayed. Because that took it from pulling out the sheath, which would be the intent to use it, to deliberate intent. It's two huge things from what I understand in the legal system. Okay? And that his hand was stayed. So, you know, and we find Abraham, and I don't guess we'll really get into the chapter because I'll dismiss in just a second. We find that in Hebrews chapter 11, if I can turn there and find it. I got to get my brain and my thoughts all together here. And so we find that when we turn over there, it talks about Abraham. Verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. And he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. You can say at that point Abraham's faith was solidified, wasn't it? He had got that far to where he was willing to do it because he was at that point in his life to where he believed, because of the promise that God had made, that in this seed will all the nations of the earth be blessed, that if he slew that seed, God would raise him up. You know, that's why he's called the father of the faithful, isn't it? They're right there.
So in the end of the matter, he did raise him up.
Yeah, in a sense.
He said in a figure he received him back from the dead. He counted him as dead.
Yep.
Because he gave Abraham credit for slaying his son. He had the full credit. Because he said in a figure there, he did get him back.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
you know, God can do things that we can't even imagine.
Right, to be done. But Abraham believed he could do it, didn't he?
Well, I like that scripture ask the question, is anything too hard for God?
No.
There ain't nothing too hard for God.
Okay. With that, we'll dismiss for the end.